Welcome to the International Spy Museum Spies and Spymasters Happy Hour. My name is Amanda Olke. I'm Director of Adult Education at the museum here in Washington, D.C. Tonight, in honor of the upcoming holiday of Halloween, we're going to be exploring some creepy cryptology with Dr. Alexander Boxer. Alex is the author of Scheme of Heaven. He is a data scientist with a PhD from MIT, and he wants you to know from the start that he does not believe in astrology. He wanted me to make sure to get that in. He is going to be joined after his presentation for a conversation with our beloved late historian, Dr. Vince Houghton. And I can finally reveal where Vince went off to and why it's so perfect that we dragged him back from the crypt, and that is because he is the new director of the National Cryptologic Museum out there at Fort Meade in the super secret area. So, hi Vince, I miss you.
Hi, we have a visit from old Elwood, and we can't have a program without the cat popping in.
Oh my goodness, well that is so exciting. So that really made everything so extraordinary. So let us jump over to Dish at the River Inn for a very extraordinary cocktail to get us started. Hey Keith, what are you mixing up for us?
My should be copyrighted marriage potion. Alex said spooky or a potion. I said, well, I only know one magical elixir, and it's a 4-ingredient cocktail with the 5th ingredient that's necessary. And the ingredients are Salsa Trace Generation Silver Tequila, about that much, I'd say 1.75 ounces. Cointreau in lieu of triple sec because we're classy over here in Foggy Bottom. And lemon juice. The story goes like this. I was living in New Haven, Connecticut, and I was living in a friend of mine's house in a separate apartment. And I used to go wandering up to go visit him. So he taught Aikido for a living. And one of the gifts that he would get from essentially teaching an Aikido seminar at the end of it, besides cold hard cash, was usually just bottles and bottles and bottles of liquor. Now, my buddy, he drank and smoked Marlboros. And he used to write these monster 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-page handwritten letters to his unrequited love, a woman by the name of Kelly Burns, who was still living out in San Diego. So I look at him and I said, what are you gonna do with the tequila? And he goes, I don't know. He goes, why don't you make a drink? And I was like, what am I gonna do with tequila? And he looked at me, he goes, you're a bartender, make a drink. And it was one of those things where I was like, oh yeah, that's right, I am. So I opened the bottle of tequila and I smelled it. And if you get past the alcohol and the hard edges, tequila smells exactly like sweet apples. So instead of doing chemistry to make a cocktail, that is known as the marrying cocktail, I decided to complement it. And since it was late October and since we're in Connecticut, cider was in season and we had a ton of it in the house. So I mixed said tequila with Cointreau, fresh squeezed lemon, raw cider, and we drank most of the bottle. So we were watching Beavis and Butthead. He was on the couch, I was in the comfy chair, and I looked at him and said something barely lucid like, that Beavis, he's pretty much the actor of our generation, isn't he? And when we got done laughing, I looked over at him and asked him the all-important question. I said, when you think about Kelly Burns, I said, when you think about the rest of your life, is Kelly Burns in it? And he says, yeah. And I said, do you think maybe you should do something about that? So it was one of those conversations you have. You don't necessarily know if the other participant is gonna, remember it the next day. All I know is the next day I give him a call and he is a whirling dervish of activity. Now, to add the extra comedic bent this story is clearly needing, he gets me on the phone with his Aikido teacher, who's an old Grand Master, He's since passed, Chiba Sensei. Chiba gets on the phone with me and he goes, Keith! And I say, yeah, his first name is BB. I go, yeah, BB. He goes, Kelly Burns, Ichiban student. I plan seminar. I bring her with me. Then in much more standard English, he said to me, he goes, by the way, when is the best fishing in Connecticut? I said, oh, right around now, third, fourth week in October. He goes, that's it, we're coming out. I go to the airport to go collect them, and we're conspiring like a couple of old matchmakers. Anyway, the missing ingredient that I mentioned previously is a willingness to act on, if you find yourself in said circumstance, to actually act on your need to settle your unrequited love. This cocktail, I assure you, will facilitate it.
I'll drink to that.
And if you like, I can make you another one. I can't guarantee it'll get you married, but it will impress your friends. It's my very screwdriver.
You want another drink, Alex, or do you want to jump in?
Maybe let's do another drink.
Okay. Pick the orange vodka of your choice. This happens to be, you know, Grey Goose orange, which is pretty good. Stoli orange is really good, and Expected Clementine is also really good. And I'm
What about these Divers Eddies? Do you like those?
Pardon me?
Something like Divers Eddy, something like that.
Gentlemen, do we know from Divers Eddy? Isn't that rum?
They have vodkas. I spent some time with it at the beach.
I haven't had it. But orange vodka, Cointreau. The secret to all great vodka drinks, fresh lemon. And then since Clementine's in season, so one night I got invited out to an industry night. And I was about 20 years older than everybody else who was standing around, but they were courteous enough to include me in the conversation. So first gentleman goes up and goes, oh, I'm making this cocktail with such and such bourbon, with such and such a, so on and so forth. And I was standing there just marginally flattered that they bothered to even include me in this sort of thing. I realized 5 recipes into it, it was a lulling conversation. And the younger bartenders were being kind and they were being deferential to me because I was older, with the expectation that I must be making something. So I said, well, I've been making a drink with orange vodka, Cointreau, fresh squeezed lemon, and fresh squeezed orange. And they said, my God, that sounds delicious. What do you call it? And I looked at them, I said, oh, I call that a screwdriver. In my industry, we call things like a screwdriver a pedal drink or a daisy drink, and there's pedals that come off of it. And a long time ago, I started looking at drink books, as all bartenders do at some point. And you start looking at them and thinking, I can fix that. Now, nothing grosser than cheap vodka with reconstituted orange juice. But if you make this with all the fresh ingredients, brand specific, I promise you, you're not going anywhere until you run out.
Oh my gosh. Well, Keith, I feel like you've made us all feel like we're actually in a super cool bar again, getting to talk to a wonderful bartender with glorious stories. So thank you for the incredible treat and the bonus drink. And really our pleasure. But don't, even if you're there in DC, do not rush down to see Keith, because unfortunately the River Inn is open, but Dish is temporarily closed. We all look forward to meeting there someday for a real drink. So thanks so much, Keith. And thanks for being with us. And Alex, over to you, and then Vince and I will reappear later.
Yeah, I just want to say that some of my fondest DC memories involve having drinks at Dish at the River Inn. So it's good to go back down memory lane. So thank you. All right. So this talk is going to focus primarily on material that's coming from my new book, which came out earlier this year, which is called A Scheme of Heaven, The History of Astrology, and the Search for Our Destiny in Data. Now, in a nutshell, the book it's a curious skeptic's guide to astrology as told from a data science perspective. So my background is in physics, as Amanda said, but my career has bounced around a professional world that, for lack of a better name, is usually just called data science. Now, the goal of data science is to develop insights, to make predictive models, to make forecasts. The idea being that somehow with enough data, enough fancy mathematics, enough clever algorithms, you can somehow get a peek into the future that maybe other people can't get. Now, this all sounds fine and good, but of course you don't need to have a particularly long memory to appreciate that many of these really fancy and sophisticated mathematical models can make horrendous predictions. And by long memory, I mean you can even just think of the various dueling COVID spread models we have going on right now, or since we're in a presidential election cycle, some of the high-profile election forecast models from 4 years ago. Now, in the data science world, particularly bad models are oftentimes jokingly said to be basically astrology or no better than astrology. And of course, this is not meant as a compliment. Now, it happens to be the case that I have a long-running interest in the history of ancient science, the history of astronomy. Helpfully, I have a proper background in Latin and Greek, and so this kind of got me thinking. What were the algorithms of ancient astrology? How did it work? And as I kind of sort of skittishly started to read astrology books, I realized that some of the basic questions I had, I just didn't really find answered. No one was really approaching it in the way I wanted to approach it. And so that was sort of the motivation behind this book. And I think this sort of basic insight, is sort of glib as it is still helpful, that there is an interesting comparison to be made between ancient astrologers and modern data scientists. And I think it's a comparison that forces us on the one hand to rethink what role astrology actually played in the development of science. And at the other hand, it also gets us to think about what role are we ascribing to data and data science today. What is it about numbers and charts and figures that are just so seductive? And are we really any better at interpreting this sort of information than we were 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago? We like to flatter ourselves that we are a modern, sophisticated scientific society, but are we really that much better? And as I write, astrologers were the quants and data scientists of their day, and those of us who are enthusiastic about the promise of numerical data to unlock the secrets of ourselves and our world would do well simply to acknowledge that others have come this way before. So astrology, as I write, was the ancient world's most ambitious applied mathematics problem. It was a grand data analysis enterprise sustained for centuries by some of history's most brilliant minds, from Ptolemy to Al-Kindi to Kepler. Just consider that for much of the last 2,000 years, the word mathematician or mathematicus simply meant an astrologer. There was no distinction. So when you think about astrologers of the ancient world, and this is of course a picture of a quite famous one, Claudius Ptolemy, famous astrologer, astronomer, you should have in mind less of maybe what you might think of as an astrologer today, somebody who's sort of interested in maybe your spiritual and metaphysical development, and more, I think, somebody like Nate Silver below, who is using numbers and mathematics and data to answer, very, or at least attempt to answer very real world questions. And also, as the case may be, maybe to come up with complicated reasons why, when things don't go as predicted, that, things are still fine. So this, of course, is a podcast with the Spy Museum. And so, the question that I think is interesting is, astrology have any connections to spycraft? And I would say absolutely yes, in at least two key respects. And that's what I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So firstly, horoscopes and astrological information in general, we're often treated in a way that I think you can be meaningfully compared to classified information. And this is especially true in Roman times, under the Roman Empire. And if you read, the histories of the time, like Tacitus and Suetonius, astrologers kind of are appearing all over the place. And in particular, everyone, is interested in when the emperor is going to die. That's sort of the chief political question of the day. And it's a question that astrology and astrologers claim that they have the technology to answer. So you find, astrology gets repeatedly banned in Rome. But it's not simply because Romans, the Roman state was opposed to astrology. Far from it. The Roman emperors are taking astrology and astrological technology and making it their own purview. They are allowed to use it, but other people are not. So, Augustus himself, who is the one who passes one of the most far-reaching bans on astrological predictions, actually is quite interested in astrology. He himself promotes himself as a Capricorn, and again, these characters are not super well known. They're sort of shadowy, but we do know that there was a father-son imperial astrology duo. They're serving all of the Julio-Claudian emperors, with notably the wise and prudent exception of Caligula. So Thrasyllus and Balbillus, father and son, serve as astrologers to the emperors for almost 100 years combined. Balbillus is such a fascinating character. He's known to have accompanied Claudius on his invasion of Britain. He at one point is made head of the Library of Alexandria, and then afterwards is made a prefect or maybe what you'd call governor of the Roman province of Egypt. So just an absolutely astounding political career for someone who is a professional astrologer. And since this is a happy hour, I thought it'd be worth to point out that we have this actually fantastic description of an astrological banquet from Roman times. This comes from the Satyricon of Petronius. This is a fictional, or an account of a fictional banquet, and it's actually famously rendered, of course, as a movie by Fellini. But this is the platter of astrological appetizers that he describes were served by Trimalchio at this ancient Roman dinner. And so we are, of course, now in the sign of Scorpio. So I guess they didn't, see fit to make a scorpion appetizer, but they describe being served a small sea fish, or a Pisculus marinus. So if you want to accompany Keith's drink with a tasty snack, maybe you can get an anchovy or something. So continuing with this theme of astrology being, of sort of great importance, both politically and militarily, the movement of entire armies is hinging on astrological data. And so one of the most famous medieval astrologers, Guido Bonatti, he boasts of having chosen not merely the day, but the precise hour for the battle called the Battle of Monteperti. This battle is a battle where this is sort of part of this Italian period where you have Guelphs versus Ghibellines. Bonatti's a Ghibelline astrologer, and this is where the Ghibelline forces of Siena actually conquer and capture the Guelph city of Florence. And this, of course, are the political allies of Dante, of the generation before Dante. And so this is considered a great catastrophe for Dante and his fellow Guelphs. And Dante places Bonatti by name in the 8th circle of hell, along with all the other soothsayers, astrologers, and forecasters. And the punishment for attempting to see a future known only to God is to have your head attached backwards to your body. Now, kind of amazingly, and I actually don't include this in my book, but I, of course, had to include it here, this sort of like espionage element of astrology continues all the way through World War II. There's this sort of humorous episode where British intelligence at some point, buys the idea that astrology is influential in the Third Reich, and they want to know what advice Hitler and his top aides might be receiving from astrologers. The answer is probably nothing. Hitler, in particular, seems to have thought astrology was something of a joke, but it was a sort of great opportunity for astrologers on both sides to sort of, let's say, self-promote themselves to the powers that be. And it ends up, one of the cool things that gets created is they end up producing spoofed editions of a German astrological magazine called Der Zenit. And so this was a real periodical, but they made some fake editions, in particular that sort of predicted the catastrophe and the downfall of the Third Reich. They print them in the UK. They secretly disseminate them throughout Germany. Probably fun for the people involved. It probably had, of course, no effect whatsoever, but fun story. But there's a second and much deeper connection between astrology and spycraft, in particular astrology and cryptology. And that is, as cryptology develops into a true mathematical discipline, it's drawing number crunching talent away from what was far and away the chief mathematical profession of the time. That's astrology. Remember, a mathematicus was an astrologer. So cryptanalysts and astrologers are both attempting to read hidden messages and identify hidden patterns, and the overlap in outlook in individuals is actually significant. Even sort of from a mechanical point of view, the sort of devices that you see getting used are not all that dissimilar. This is, and one of the reasons I bring this up is that this astrological device called an astrolabe plays actually a significant role in my book. It's sort of the preeminent calculating tool that astrologers use, and it consists of course, spinnable discs on top of stationary discs, not unlike a cipher wheel. Now, astrolabes actually go back to Greco-Roman times, maybe around the time of Claudius Ptolemy or a bit later, although the oldest ones we have come from the Islamic period. But, you know, again, there's sort of this interesting similarity. So maybe a quick word about the organization of my book. I organized the book in terms of a sequence of questions, sort of questions about astrology that I wanted to answer. And I try to answer them in two ways, both by looking at ancient texts and by looking at modern data. And part of this is because I want to avoid the trap of saying astrology believes this or astrologers believe that. It's really, you know, something that is a very broad topic and it's changing, of course. Different people at different times are believing different things, even at the same time. I bet you could never, even today, I imagine you could not get two astrologers in a room and have them agree on what they believe. So, you know, the solution to this is, well, I'm not going to look at astrology in general. I'm looking at, you know, specific astrologers and what they say, and hopefully choosing moments in time that are sort of representative of when people are trying to answer, you know, some basic questions that I had. And looking at how they answered them. And so, and of course, one thing that makes it fun is I try to situate each chapter at a very specific moment in place and time and calculate what the heavens look like at that time from that place. That is, of course, a horoscope, or as it was often called, a scheme of heaven, hence the title of my book. Of course, my book is a play on words. Scheme of heavens refers to both the say visual diagram of the heavens, but also the sleight of hand involved in how you interpret that. Now, with this being said, it was sort of obvious where I would situate the discussion of astrology and its connection to cryptology and also steganography, and that is medieval Baghdad under the Abbasid Caliphate. Now, for one thing that made it an obvious choice is that here was actually a moment where I didn't have to go and say compute the horoscope from scratch. The horoscope of Baghdad's founding is already known. It was a city that was founded at a specific auspicious moment in time that was chosen by the Caliph al-Mansur's astrologers. And so on the left, you see one of the older manuscripts that actually preserves this horoscope. Of course, it doesn't quite look the same as what you might think a modern horoscope looks like. And on the right is how I draw the horoscopes in my book, which is to actually use the projection that's used in an astrolabe. It's a very interesting mathematical projection. It plays an important role in the history of science, and this is something that astrologers were using all the time. So Baghdad, you know, in this period is just this absolutely fascinating city. It's founded according, you know, to cosmological principles. It was originally designed with, you know, 3 concentric circles, 3 walls, 4 gates pointing to the 4 cardinal directions, and you just have this incredible ingathering of talent there. In particular, living at exactly, you know, the same time, the people who would have known each other and rubbed shoulders all the time. You have Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm. The Latinization of Al-Khwarizmi's name was algorithmi, and whose treatise on, you know, how to solve certain mathematical equations is actually the word that gives us the word algebra. At the exact same time, you have another just famous polymath, Al-Kindi, and Al-Kindi is sort of the most enthusiastic and prolific champion for translating Greek text into Arabic. And it's important to note that, you know, this is a society that's interested in what they can learn from the Greeks, in particular from a very technological point of view. And astrology was considered an important technology. How do you actually harness the power of the stars? Keep in mind, right, this whole city is founded according to trying to maximize the astrological power of the stars. And so from Al-Kindi, we have texts on, you know, astrological weather forecasting. We also have a really curious text on how to kind of like understand and manipulate astral rays from the planets. Now, in addition to just being a brilliant polymath on all subjects, he is in particular the very first that we know of to discuss in writing the use of frequency analysis in cryptology. This is, of course, the foundation of all mathematical cryptanalysis. It's the idea being that in a given language, the different letters are going to appear, some more often, some less often. If you know the distribution of that, you can all of a sudden very easily crack very simple forms of ciphers. So Al-Kindi is oftentimes regarded as the father of mathematical cryptanalysis. Now, Baghdad under the Abbasids is the birthplace of cryptanalysis, also in an even more literal way. Of course, what's going on is that both Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Kindi were instrumental in promoting the adoption of Hindu numerals, that is, the numbering system that was used in India. And in particular, this includes the placeholder digit 0. Now, the Arabic word for 0 is cipher, and this ends up getting transferred to the Latin West by a gentleman named Leonardo Pisano, who's better known as Fibonacci. It's Fibonacci of the famous Fibonacci sequence. So he's the first to introduce this concept in Latin, and he transliterates cipher as zephyrum. So this gives us actually rise to two important words. One is the word 0, and the other is the word cipher. Cipher, in many Romance languages can mean just a digit, but it also has the significance it has in English of, an algorithm that's mapping, symbols to symbols. So, but the act of enciphering and deciphering initially referred to simply the practice of converting into and out of Arabic numerals. And so you can imagine if you were, a merchant or doing some sort of bookkeeping, you're used to seeing Roman numerals or who knows what system, and all of a sudden you're seeing the Hindu Arabic numbers that we're familiar with. It probably would have looked very, very strange, very much like a secret code, and how you can do mathematical equations so effectively with them probably did seem like some sort of secret code. Now, in addition to all these developments in mathematics, science, medicine, astronomy that are happening at this time, you also have important developments in astrology. And there's this, really sort of fascinating astrological innovation, which is the theory of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction theory of history. Much of astrology really doesn't change that much. Much of it really is sort of codified as this combination of Babylonian and Greek ideas sort of around the time, sort of Roman era. This is a new idea, sort of the most important new idea that happens to astrology in a long time, probably in its history. And so the idea being that the planets Jupiter and Saturn, as they make their way around the sky, it takes Saturn about 30 years to orbit the sky. It takes Jupiter 12. They come into alignment about every 20 years. And the zodiac sign that they come into alignment with follows an interesting pattern where they tend to draw out these triangles in the sky. So Kepler was also interested in this idea. So here's a diagram actually from Kepler. The idea being that if you have a conjunction in a particular point in the sky, after two more conjunctions, it'll return to roughly the same spot. So you end up drawing these triangles over the course of 60 years in the sky. Now, the way the zodiac is split up, it turns out that they tend to have these conjunctions in the signs that are associated with the classical elements. So 3 of the signs are associated with fire, 3 of the signs with earth, 3 of the signs of water, and 3 of the signs with air. And so what happens is you end up with this pattern. So here's actually it drawn out with modern data over the last couple thousand years. The idea being that you sort of stay in the same elemental triangle for about 10 conjunctions or 200 years, and then it switches to the next next triplicity, and then the next one. So after about 800 years, you've kind of gone through this whole cycle in the sky. Now, if you look at the modern data, the transition isn't as sharp as maybe it was described in ancient times, but it's still there. You can still sort of see history unfolding to this interesting pattern. And the idea was that this was actually governing history in an important way. And so the fiery conjunction, the fiery triplicity that begins in 26 BC is thought to have heralded the birth of Jesus and the Christian era. The conjunction in a watery sign that begins in 571 is thought to signal the rise of Arabs and Islam, et cetera, et cetera. So you have this idea where, these big events are heralded by a transition of the triplicity, a transition of the conjunction from one elemental sign into another. And so this theory of history was actually at the time for many years considered very scientific. It was a quantitative, mathematical, and seemingly rational way to describe history. And so, when the Black Plague ravages through Europe, wipes out probably a third of the population in the 1300s, the physicians at the University of Paris, when they were asked about it, they write treatises and they say, well, it was caused by a corruption of the atmosphere due to a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which had occurred in Aquarius in the year 1345. Now, as a fun factoid, we are currently in a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction year. It's happening in the sign of Aquarius right now during our time of COVID. So something to scratch your head about. And so people used to write histories along this line. So one of the more famous ones is there was a French Catholic cardinal named Pierre d'Ailly. He writes from the year 1400, The History of the World, and he goes into the future because he can use this system to sort of predict the future. And he ends his history with a warning that the Antichrist could probably be expected to arrive in the year 1789, which, for a French writer is significant. That was the year of the French Revolution. However, far and away, the most eyebrow-raising astrological prediction using the sort of planetary theory of history goes to the German monk Johannes Trithemius, and he is not vague at all. He states very bluntly that liberty will not be restored to the Jews prior to August 1880. He's not hedging his bets by saying, within 100 years or even a decade. No, it's a specific month. And it's interesting to note that the first trio of Zionist settlements in Ottoman Palestine was established, in fact, in 1882. So here I'm just going to quote from my book. So with so many possible patterns correlating with so many historical storylines, what is one to make of the conjunction theory of history? Unlike with other astrological assertions where an analysis might entail an elaborate hunt for the faintest hint of correlation, here the correlations seem to leap out from everywhere. But are any of them genuine? This is roughly analogous to the engineering distinction between noise, where nothing looks like a signal, and clutter, where everything looks like a signal. Perhaps, though, an even better analogy can be made to cryptology. History here becomes like a secret code, and we want to know if astrology is its key. But not all of the universe's secrets are encrypted with a cipher. Therefore, not all of the universe's secrets are susceptible to the mathematical tricks of decipherment. Occasionally, some of the deepest secrets can be found hiding right before our eyes. The practice of concealing a message in plain sight, so to speak, is called steganography. It's from the Greek word stego, meaning to cover, and grapho, meaning to write. Steganography is a much more devious craft than conventional cryptography, since while it's obvious that a text in cipher is concealing a secret message, however difficult it may be to decipher, the object of steganography is to deflect your suspicion that there's any secret at all. Simply put, anything can, and most everything has, historically been used to cloak secrets in settings that are otherwise perfectly public, be it poetry, music, botanical drawings, and even star charts. Could astrology likewise be used as a cover for secret communication? In fact, as recently as 1996, a hidden message was discovered to have been concealed in the astrological tables of a notorious occult manuscript from the 1500s. The mischievous monk who devised the scheme was Johannes Trithemius, whose astrological prediction concerning the political fortunes of the Jews we cited earlier. Remarkably, Trithemius even went so far as to write an entire book about steganography, which, appropriately enough, he disguised to make it look like a book of magical spells for summoning spirits. Pretty neat trick, don't you think? So here's an example for a famous cryptological treatise by Vigenère, showing how you can encode a secret message using the positions of stars. But here's actually a picture of the famous book 3 of Trithemius's Steganographia, which was not cracked until the mid-90s. This is actually contains a hidden message in what looks like astrological data. Now, after all those years, it turned out the hidden message wasn't that exciting. It was essentially the medieval version of the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog. But if you like this sort of games, I will tell you that there is at least one, possibly more, steganographically concealed messages in a scheme of heaven. So if there's, not a mathematical way to establish whether, a secret code is real or a steganographic cipher is real, how do you evaluate a steganographic cipher? How do you tell if the hidden pattern or secret code you think you've discovered is real, or alternatively, if you're just nuts? So here we enter William and Elizabeth Friedman, everyone's favorite husband-wife cryptologic duo. So the Friedmans, I imagine for this audience, not much needs to be said about them, but William Friedman was America's preeminent code breaker during the 20th century. In particular, he headed up the efforts during World War II to crack the Japanese code purple. But his interest in not only cryptology, but steganography extends across both his and Elizabeth's entire careers. And in fact, it's how they met They originally met because they're both part of the same project funded by a fairly quirky millionaire to look for hidden messages in the plays and sonnets of William Shakespeare. This was a very fashionable theory in the early 20th century that Francis Bacon was the true author and not Shakespeare, and people were convinced that there were hidden messages somehow in the text, concealed steganographically. And so this sort of sparked the Friedmans' lifelong interest in steganography. And here's actually a wonderful picture. I have to thank Bill Sherman for alerting my attention to this picture. But this is a picture from World War I, back when they were training officers in the Signal Corps. And they're actually using a Baconian cipher to spell out knowledge is power. Of course, they run out of people, so they end up spelling knowledge as powy, but you get the idea. And it has to do with whether the individuals are facing forward or to the side. So that is actually how the hidden message is encoded. So very fun. As another way, you can't mention astrology, steganography, cryptology without mentioning the Voynich manuscript. This is the quote-unquote world's most mysterious manuscript. I wish I could tell you more about what it is, but nobody knows. But yes, it's hundreds of pages of a strange text involving a lot of astrological diagrams, plant diagrams, and naked women, and lots and lots of text written in a strange script that you would think would be plenty for cryptanalysts to crack, but they never have. The Friedmans couldn't do it, and nobody has done it since. So at the end of their career, after the Friedmans had both retired from a long career of serving the government in crypto, both Elizabeth and William served as cryptanalysts, they returned to the problem that they had met, their original problem that brought them together in the first place, which was, are there hidden messages in Shakespeare's plays? Of course, they both had felt for a long time that this was absurd, but how do you show this? How do you sort of prove a negative? And I think this book is actually really interesting. The Shakespearean ciphers examined, it's from 1957. They sort of exhaustively go, theory after theory, sort of debunking all of these one by one. But what's interesting is that there's no general rule for how you can debunk this, but they come up with sort of two general principles, which I think are great because they sort of throw the burden of proof back at the person who's coming up with the crazy claim, as opposed to the people who have to evaluate, or sort of somehow prove a negative. And so the two principles they come up with are that whatever decryption procedure is proposed must give a sensible result when applied rigorously. So the problem with all these Shakespearean ciphers was that people would choose a letter here, then not choose a letter there, sort of, haphazard to get the message that they wanted. You have to do this rigorously. Or if you look at the if you look at the conjunction theory of history, we're talking about the era of Christianity beginning with a conjunction that's in 26 BC. Why should that have anything to do with the birth of Jesus, which, maybe doesn't happen for another 20 some odd years. The second criterion they come up with is that the solution must be unique. As they write in their book, just as there's only one valid solution to a scientific or mathematical problem, so there's only one valid solution to a cryptogram. To find two quite different solutions would be an absurdity. And so they put this into practice in a very fun way, in that Friedman uses this, they use the same technique that these people have proposed on the same text to show that you could use them to say, maybe Theodore Roosevelt was the true author, or Gertrude Steiner. They have a famous example where, from the text, they developed a message where William Friedman himself confesses to be the author of Shakespeare. So if you can get, the same method applied to the same text can give you multiple conflicting messages, then that's a good argument that, hey, this is not a real cipher. And so thus, whatever you conclude about the conjunction theory of history should properly depend on how uniquely you think it correlates with one sequence of historical dates and not any others. And this in turn suggests a pattern matching game. So here's the one I have in my book. There's a particularly infamous correlation of Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions and US presidential peril. So if you can see, actually, you can line up all of the most recent Jupiter-Saturn conjunctions with something bad that has happened to the US president. Now, again, you have to, of course, apply a lot of wiggle room, right? William Henry Harrison actually dies before the conjunction, and really nothing particularly bad happened to George W. Bush, even though he was in office during a conjunction year. But of course, I had to dig deep and say, well, he did almost choke to death on a pretzel. However, whatever you predict, get ready. The next Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is coming fast. It's scheduled for this year, December 21, 2020. So, get whatever you decide to associate with these dates, this is a good time to test it. So thank you very much. That is my talk. Of course, the book is called A Scheme of Heaven. I encourage you to purchase it. I believe you can purchase it through the Spy Museum's bookstore. But I also want to call your attention to my website too. We have some fun interactive tools, in particular an interactive astrolabe, so you can see how some of these cosmological charts are made. I also have some interactive tools relating to the work of Trithemius, which may be of interest to this crowd too. So with that, I will end my presentation, and you guys can take back the screen.
Thank you, Alex. It's interesting to be doing this again. I like to say that everything I say is out of the mouth of Vince Houghton and does not represent the opinion or endorsement of the National Security Agency or the National Cryptologic Museum. I'm learning all those fun things I've got to say now. But I did read this book and I enjoyed it. I wasn't expecting to be perfectly honest. As the announcement for the actual program says, I am the true skeptic. I look at this and just laugh. I mean, one of my favorite graphics is it has all the astrological signs and it says the position of the stars has no impact in your life, the position for every single one of them, and just the idea of silliness. And so I am a bit of a convert when it comes not to astrology, but to your position on this about how it's a very different world than kind of what we think of as look in the back of the newspaper for Gemini and it says exactly what it says for everything else. It's a different wording. What's interesting to me, and I wonder if you can address this, I'm wondering if this is really just a question of what we can term lexical semantics, where we're calling something astrology today that probably Ptolemy may not have called astrology. If Ptolemy was presented with the Sunday, astrology section, he probably would have chuckled at it, saying, "This is ridiculous. What I'm doing is science." And somewhat same degree of what people later on, like Kepler and others, were doing, the idea of looking at the universe and trying to find patterns and trying to find truths and trying to find things that are demonstrable, things that are empirical versus just kind of nonsense that we kind of think of like Miss Cleo today. Are we just using is the word astrology now so tainted with the silliness of today that actually kind of, the reason I thought it was silly to begin with, kind of puts a barrier for people to kind of embrace what you're arguing, embrace this book as the argument that it is.
Well, so I think, so one of the questions that I was most interested in answering is, the words astrology and astronomy through much of the ancient times are practically interchangeable. Some authors use them some way, some authors use them another. But so to use the term astrology isn't incorrect, even though I agree with you that modern astrology sort of has this rebirth in the 20th century and it's reborn in a very different way than it had been known in the past. But I think, astrology was the term that had been used for thousands of years. I mean, these people are attempting to do what astrologers also attempt to do today, which is to correlate events in the heavens with events on the earth, whether at an individual or a group level. And yeah, somebody like Kepler was very interested in this question. Kepler, you can see, just the sharpness of his mind. I mean, he's investigating these questions actually quite seriously, and he ultimately concludes that there's really nothing there. But this was a question that was very important at the time. And a point I make in my book is that, if you are the jobs of an astronomer and astrology were essentially one and the same. Now you need a knowledge of the sun, the moon, and the stars to do all sorts of practical applications like navigation, calendar regulation, etc. But to track the positions of the planets, there was absolutely not a single practical application for tracking the positions of the planets, except astrology. And yet it was this application that ultimately drove the scientific revolution.
Let me follow that up by asking you, this is going to really annoy some people. The modern intelligence community is their job is to provide actionable intelligence about real-time scenarios. Their job is to provide things that warfighters can use on a day-to-day basis and things that the president can use. But a lot of what they do is prediction, is providing estimates. What is the Chinese economy going to look like in 50 years? What's the new Russian hypersonic missile? It's with no knowledge, just but kind of educated guesses. They wouldn't call it that, certainly, and a lot of what the intelligence community does is what we call warning intelligence, where they're providing, here comes something bad, I'm predicting something coming. There's not a whole lot of difference. And you kind of mentioned this in the book about like kind of this early intelligence. Now, granted, they're saying this is when someone's going to die, or this is when, you know, the harvest this year is going to be bad, but they're looking to data in order to make those predictions. So do you see a dramatic difference between what people were doing hundreds of years ago and what the IC is doing today?
Well, I guess, of course, I would extend it, you know, well beyond the IC that, you know, all of us in the data world, I think, are doing something similar. And we, you know, there's a famous quote that the purpose of economic forecasts is to make astrology look respectable. You know, people, you know, in the financial world, political world, et cetera, everyone wants to know what's going to happen. And I think what's interesting to me is that, you know, once you kind of put a quantitative veneer on a prediction, people treat it very, very differently. And so, and I think that was kind of one of the motivations for writing this book, that, you know, I see this all the time, where, you know, you can have a prediction that's or a model that's, you know, ultimately ridiculous, but it's got a lot of fancy graphs and it's got a lot of, you know, complicated numbers, and people will give it a credence they won't if you were to package it in some different way. And so in that respect, I think our ability to, as data consumers, is something that I'm interested in. It's not obvious to me that we as data consumers are somehow more savvy than the people we like to make fun of several thousand years ago.
Well, I've a ton more questions, but what I want to do is to push it off to our audience and bring Amanda back in here, because they're going to get mad at me if I hog all the questions. I'm sure there's plenty from those out there. So let me kick it to you, Amanda.
Since you're enraging the IC community, you know, with your horoscope comparisons, we got some simple questions and we have some complex questions. So first of all, Alex, a former colleague of ours wanted to know if you picked up languages to do this research, because you had certainly some fascinating different types of documents and you were looking at.
So I didn't pick up any to do this work, but I guess I had the fortune that you know, I had a classical education growing up, so, you know, Greek and Latin were things I kind of knew well. I for some of the Arabic stuff, I had some really wonderful friends who, you know, that's their mother tongue, things like that. So, but yes, the language element was important. The ability to access the text was very important to me. It's something that I feel like is lacking in a lot of studies of this particular subject. And it's also why in the very beginning, I recused myself entirely from a discussion of a Chinese or Indian astrology. You know, I don't really know anything about it, and more importantly, I have no way to actually access the original text. So it's such a big topic as it is. I narrowed my focus from the get-go to just the Western tradition, which is largely Greek and some Latin, and you know, some other languages.
Do Al-Kindi's books still exist, and where can they be found?
So this is another problem that you know, a lot of the source material of astrology, at least the history of astrology, is not very well. It's not super easy to get this stuff. However, that's starting to change, and so you know, in particular, texts on, you know, Kindi's text on weather forecasting. There's some monographs that have appeared on those in the last 10 years, maybe. His book on rays is quite interesting because, you know, there's a lot of texts that we know of from Greek times, things that are written by Ptolemy that only survive in Arabic. So Ptolemy's treatise on, you know, the mathematical projections making an astrolabe only survives in Arabic. There's an equivalent number of things that were written in Arabic that only survive in Latin. So Al-Kindi's treatise on astral rays actually only survives in Latin. I actually don't know if there's an English translation. Oh, there is. Yes, there is an English translation of it. But yes, these are things that, you know, I actually wrote the book in DC. It was really wonderful to be walking distance to the Library of Congress. But yes, these are not, the source material is not easy to get. at least some of them are not. Some of them actually are digitized online. You can get them on the internet, but some of them are still tricky to get. And there's still a huge number that have never been translated, and it's sort of an ongoing project that I think the academic world the history of science world is sort of taking a new interest in astrology and treating these things differently.
Yeah, I was really intrigued in, seeing an article that got me interested in your book, and just these roots of cryptology and the ancient, Arab world. I don't know. I can't really wrap my head around it. And Vince, this is your new full-time world, so I'm counting on you when I need this explained to me. So I know you recused yourself from talking about Chinese and Indian astrology, but did most, such a blanket statement, but did most cultures have some form of astrology? Is everybody trying to interpret the stars?
I don't actually know how to answer that question. So I might just say the honest answer is I don't know. Certainly you see it very prominently in China, India, and the whole Middle East and Europe. So I think you have things like this in the Andean civilizations too. But one of the tightropes I tried to walk in my book was to, I'm a quantitative person. I tried to speculate and generalize as little as possible. And so I feel like this is one of those things where the most honest answer I can say is I don't know.
Did Alexander the Great use astrology?
That is a fascinating question. The answer seems to be yes. So Alexander is an interesting character for many reasons, but from the history of astrology, he, regardless of what he did or did not do, he represents the sort of moment where East meets West. He conquers, what had been the Persian Empire, and all of this knowledge, in particular astrological knowledge, comes flooding into the Greek-speaking world. And Alexander himself seems to have been quite taken. He conquers Babylon. He seems to have been quite taken with the Babylonian astrologers, and he was actually quite taken with a lot of Babylonian culture. I mean, Babylon was, apparently this was really incredible and tremendous place. And I imagine if you had grown up as a Macedonian, Babylon was probably something to see. Now, there's of course all these stories floating around, of which I include in my book, that there's a very famous lunar eclipse that occurs right before Alexander's final battle against Darius, and it was the sources we have of the closest to the time seem to indicate that this was widely perceived, at least in the Babylonian community, as bad news for Darius and good news for Alexander. And so he seems to have been quite taken with this. But again, with all these ancient things, you're going on ancient accounts that are themselves talking about things which happened long before they happened. So, but yes, Alexander seems to, I would imagine, from what I've read, I would say that I'd be willing to go on to venture and say that yes, he probably was quite interested in astrology.
I want to jump in and ask a question. I lied that I was done asking questions. As a historian, I actually found it pretty fascinating where we're now able to use, or at least you were able to use, and I assume others are, astrological data to figure out exact times for things in the past that we didn't have great records of. Because you're able to trace it back to kind of almost mythological or folklore discussions of eclipses or of the way the stars were at a certain time, and go, we know now that the only time that could have been was X, like the death of Caesar and things to that effect, where they tended to be more general. But now we can actually use this data by these astrologers to kind of you pinpoint it within the day in certain circumstances, because we know exactly when the stars and everything else were where they are.
Well, the key thing there is the eclipses. So you have these tremendous records. In particular, out of Babylon, you have this it's something like a 700-year program of taking nightly observations of the sky. They were obsessed with knowing what was going on in the sky. It's quite possibly the longest continuous research program ever undertaken. They were just really interested in this and willing to institutionally keep it going. So these records sort of survive in antiquity. Many of them survive to this day. And to be honest, it is because of those eclipse records, similar eclipse records in China, that we are able to actually know certain very important modern things, because the truth is the Earth's rate of rotation is slowing down in an uneven way. And it's only by matching up some of these ancient records with, our orbital models that we can actually kind of tweak some of these parameters for, these sorts of quantities, which actually affect questions of, say, like how quickly are the, is sort of the Earth's surface bouncing back from the last ice age. These sorts of quantities actually, believe it or not, all rely on data which at some level goes back to people matching it up with ancient eclipses.
Okay, I love this. We got a few more good questions, but I've been saving this one up because I love it so much. Did the ancient astrologers ever set up their own tests, such as independent analysis or double-blind standards, to determine if a prediction was right or could be duplicated? And I'm like, that is a great question.
To my knowledge, no. But what I
you don't want to find out you're wrong. You don't want to, announce it if you're wrong, I'm sure.
Well, but so some of one of the characters I was quite interested in, mainly because he leaves us a really interesting body of text, is a astrologer who's around the time of Ptolemy, and his name is Vettius Valens. And what we have from Vettius Valens is he's sort of like a working astrologer, and we have case studies of it's 123 different individuals, real individuals. We don't know their names, but he has their when they were born, and what had happened to them, how they died in horrific ways or whatever. And there's a group of 6 people who he's quite interested in, because they were all involved in a near shipwreck at sea. It seems to be that he himself was actually one of these 6 people, because he seems to know a lot about it. But I would describe somebody like Vettius Valens as somebody who's trying to do this in a scientific way. Now, of course, I think one of the chief problems is that statistics is hard. People don't have an intuitive and natural grasp of statistics, even today. I think they certainly didn't back then. But the idea that it could be an empirical science was absolutely followed by a number of people. Actually, and of course, the obvious example is Kepler, who Kepler has over 1,000 birth horoscopes drawn up with his own hand. He was absolutely interested in poring over this. And by the way, those horoscopes weren't even published in the collected works of Kepler. The Gesamtwerk is like a work in progress. They've been producing it for like 80 years, and the Astrological one just came out a couple years ago. So I mean, these are things that are like, now you can go and you can look at all of these horoscopes that Kepler's drawn. Yes, these are people who fundamentally have a scientific bent, at least many of them. They are collecting data, they're gathering data, they're trying to find patterns. And by the way, the patterns of the sun and the moon and the stars absolutely affect life on Earth. They affect the seasons, the tides, the whatever. The idea that the planets might do something similar isn't, on the face of it, absurd. And in order to sort of prove that this isn't happening, you kind of do need a lot of data, and you kind of do need a sense of statistical significance, all of which isn't even developed until the 20th century. And we still do it really badly.
So many of these play in each other, but somewhat, and I alluded to that, not wanting to be wrong. And one of the readers of your book mentioned the possibility of executions for inaccurate predictions, and then suggested maybe we should get this back in play today. And so I'm not sure it's a question, but more of a comment.
Well, so there's this I do know from my superficial reading of the Chinese history, but yes, there's a famous example of the Chinese astrologers who mispredict the eclipse and end up getting beheaded. Whether this is true or legend, who knows? But yes, I think especially in the Babylonian context, if you're interested in these sorts of eclipses, there's a lot of pressure on you to get it right. And yes, as far as our horrible predictive models today, I don't know if execution is the right answer, but I think it's pretty clear that the incentive structure of who gets paid to say what is very skewed, very skewed. So maybe we can work on just fixing the money part before we start sending people off to the gallows.
Vince, someone wants to know if you might cover some of these early origins in your new museum.
Well, that remains to be seen. Like the Spy Museum, we're in the process of developing a new museum ourselves. And who knows what the content will be? Maybe something like this. This is, you're dead on. I mean, the father of cryptology is someone who dabbled. It's not. That's probably the wrong word. It's someone who was very involved in this. And of course, the Friedmans are. William Friedman is considered the father of the NSA, and Elizabeth is now finally, because of a couple authors getting her due. Arguably she was better than he was, but yeah. So there's certainly some crossover here.
Alex, what does your work indicate about the concept of predetermination? Just a little question.
So this is one of those topics that's, of course, such an important and fascinating thread throughout the history of astrology, and because I think what it shows to me is, okay, so to go back up, this question of, is astrology part of a fatalistic system? And I think you have this fundamental conflict throughout astrology. Either it's fated, in which case you're not going to be able to avoid something anyways, or there's a sense where it's more like the weather, where if you know what's going to happen, you can kind of take steps to mitigate it, right? Like if it's saying it's thunderclouds are gathering outside, maybe you don't want to play golf. And alternatively, if you know that Mars is going to be in the 4th house on a particular day, maybe that's not when you want to buy a house or something, right? That implies that there's sort of a physical cause and effect. Whereas if it's truly fatalistic, then you might as well just go along for the ride. There's nothing you can do. And this sort of contradiction is around in astrology all the time. And one of the points I bring up is that I think one of the reasons it spread so wildly throughout the Roman Empire is that it spread in a very, very particularly fatalistic form. And it just so happened that the Romans themselves were really into fatalism. Stoicism is, Stoicism seems to be having some sort of strange vogue these days, but sort of the key element of Stoicism is that everything is absolutely preordained, and that it's simply your job just to come to terms with it. And this astrology, fit in with this exactly. And so this idea that maybe astrology is true, maybe astrology is not, but the point is that everything that's happening is connected to every other event, because everything is preordained. It doesn't matter what signs you're reading. The signs will always, point, if you can read the signs, it will tell you the future with certainty. And this is actually the thing that gets astrology into trouble by the time Christianity comes around, because, Christianity, requires free will. If there's no free will, then, Adam didn't need to sin. He didn't need to be, people didn't need to be redeemed, et cetera, et cetera. You get burned at the stake for questioning these things. And I give an example of an astrologer. Astrology at the time kind of led you. It was something. Well, it wasn't God's will. It was, just it was the planets. It's all part of the natural system. And there's at least one astrologer who was burned at the stake for this, for not backing down on his insistence on predetermined, that everything was predestined. So, but I think astrology is so interesting because it's such a compelling little system. It's such a seductive little system that doesn't really matter. People are really into it today who I would say in no means agree with predestination. I think it's all part of the sense that you can grow, and transcend yourself spiritually as a person. Stoics would have laughed at that. And so I think that you can be on absolutely opposite sides of the metaphysical spectrum and still somehow like astrology. And I think that somehow speaks to something deeper about the way it uses sort of like really cool graphics and numbers and figures to just kind of make patterns of everything.
So this leads to a really great last question, which is almost a gotcha question. Even though, and Vince, you can answer this too. It's for Alex in particular about your research. Was there ever a moment where you did a second, a double take on some of the predictions, or thought, maybe they've got something there. Vince, you know.
No. No. I mean, I think it's throwing darts at a dartboard in many cases, but I mean, it's the people who are better at predicting are better at throwing darts. I think that they practice that part of it too. I mean, it's to try to provide someone with some kind of data. Let's use the word data because that's what we've been using. Data-based predictive model, whether it's nonsense or not. I mean, what's crazy to me about the predictive side of things is that if you say there's a 49% chance of something happening, that doesn't necessarily mean it means in 49% of other events like this, you're going to get that outcome. You're like, oh my God, that's certainly going to happen. Like, that's less than half, right? How do you not see that? So I have a real problem with the way that people, even in the intelligence community, look at prediction. There's far too much weight placed on estimates and on this kind of analysis where, if you're wrong, it could be disastrous. And if you're right, then there's a lot of things that come, paradoxes and other things that come into play that ends up screwing you in the end anyway. So the idea is just, don't make predictions because, I'm not sure there's a reason for it. And maybe in the real world, like where people are predicting baseball scores or the Super Bowl champions and they're getting paid a fortune to do it, then there is you talked about the stick idea of beheading people or burning them at the stake of making mistakes. Maybe there are some carrots when it comes to making good predictions, certainly in the world and certainly in sports and betting and other places. But in the intel community, there's not. I mean, there's you do it because it's your job. You do it because it's kind of being demanded upon you because of national security. But there's not a lot of glory in it. Even if you're right, no one's ever going to know because it'll be classified for the rest of your life and probably your kid's life. So I have a love-hate relationship with prediction. I love it when I want to know who's going to win the Super Bowl. I dislike it in the realm of intelligence because it's just really tricky.
Well, there's an old quote that is, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future.
Well, I predict that we're all gonna, stay in tonight, and when we go out tomorrow, we'll probably wear masks. That's my prediction. So that's the kind of prediction I like to make. I want to thank you both for being here. It's so neat to meet you, Alex. Really loved reading your articles and getting a look at your book and getting an excuse to bring Vince back from the grave for this light Halloween themed talk. And I want to thank everyone who attended for coming tonight. I want to thank Keith from Dish at the River Inn. That was really fun. I liked hearing his epic stories. And I also predict that you're feeling really generous and that you probably want to donate to the Mission Resilience campaign at the Spy Museum so we can keep doing cool programs like this. And I see in the stars that if you donate, a handsome stranger will match your amount dollar for dollar. I'm so cheesy, sorry, but I have to do it.
So for you, Amanda, just so the audience knows out there, I wore a special Halloween costume just for you today. I'm dressed like an adult this year for Halloween, which this is the first time in a long time.
I haven't seen you in a suit coat in a year and a half. Anyway, it's just fun. It's fun to be, Alex, thank you for letting us have a mini reunion with your super cool topic. And anyway, back to the donation, because I'm a one-track mind, but you might even donate whatever your astral number is. Mine is 4. Maybe yours is 1,000. I don't know. I had to get in my one last cheesy joke. Thanks everybody for being. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Vince. Thank you, Keith. Bye, guys.